All right, let's talk Kropotkin, Conquest of Bread, Chapter 2. The title of this chapter is Well-Being for All, and it's not looking good. so, so he starts out this chapter by, he notes that production is growing faster than population, in contradiction with Malthusian doctrine, right? Malthusian doctrine was that, population grows geometrically while food production grows arithmetically, or that is to say, linearly. And so, obviously we're going to have this horrible crash, and, we need to control population sizes and yada, yada, yada. Kropotkin correctly notes that Malthus has been, destroyed by the advances of technology. But then he goes on to say, quote, "The more thickly men are crowded on the soil, the more rapid is the growth of their wealth-creating power." Now, this is hilariously wrong, because it's like pretending that there's no point where that's going to turn back over again, right? This is, of course, a major problem with the deterministic view of history to begin with. It's not true that human productivity increases willy-nilly over time. There's certainly things that people can do to make it so that their particular civilization collapses, under the weight of totalitarianism or something like that. You can look at something like Mises' essay, Economics and the Revolt Against Reason, which I'll have a link for, to kind of see how this mechanism plays out and how this deterministic view of history is just wrong. And of course, even if they have a point right now, it's still not as simple as the determinists would have you believe. The incentives and structures must exist which encourage people to save, invest, and to produce more than they consume. If you take away those incentives, things collapse very rapidly. Socialism, that is to say, the state ownership of the means of production, and communism, that is to say, communal ownership of the means of production, are precisely the kinds of structures which discourage saving, investment, and overproduction. When I say overproduction, I don't mean overproduction, I mean just like production of any surplus whatsoever. Of course, we talked, I mentioned this last time, but the Misesian and Hayekian arguments, not to mention public choice and there's a fourth one. But, all these arguments against central planning still continue to apply when you basically are going to take all of the means of production and concentrate them into the hands of one person or group of people. Contra Marx, the course of history is not determined in the sense that Marx means it. It may be that, reality is deterministic in some sense, but in a meaningful social perspective, it's entirely possible for small groups of people, or even large, significant groups of people, to impoverish themselves by abolishing or weakening private property. For instance, there's an article by Rothbard called "The Difference Between the Market and the Bureaucracy" that kind of touches on this point. Or there's an article by Ryan McMakin titled "Socialism, Not U.S. Sanctions, Ruined the Venezuelan Economy." I'll have links for those as well. It's not true that thicker population density necessarily leads to more rapid growth of production. There will be an inflection point somewhere where the negatives of increasing population density, right, outweigh the benefits. It's true that if a man is so isolated from others that trade and specialization are detrimental wastes of time, right? You can imagine a world where everyone lives, individually on a small desert island, and there's 1,000 miles of open, ocean between him and the next island, right? Obviously you're not going to bother trading in that case, because you've got your own problems to deal with, and the act of moving that 1,000 miles makes is far more effort than anything you would expect to get out of the trade itself. But it's also true that if you take people and you literally pack them like sardines into boxcars, as communists do, that those people aren't very productive either. So it's pretty clear that Kropotkin is making an argument here that is easily vulnerable to an argument ad absurdum, right? He's like, well, we just pack more people in and things get better. It's like, no, that's not true. There is a limit to how much you can do that. there's limits in both directions, but you can't just take this one idea and extrapolate it out to infinity. And this is something that Kropotkin is seeming to do with a disturbing regularity. The next thing that he talks about, and this is a great thing to poke at here, is he laments the existence of idlers and middlemen. Now, this is the same fallacy or the same mistake that was a major part of physiocratic thought. Physiocrats were a French school of economists that had a lot of good points about their economic analysis, but at the same time, they made some serious mistakes in their value theory that crippled them as a movement, basically. It's not true that only certain basic types of labor, agriculture, mining, fishing, etc., are productive, right? There are cases in an economy where middlemen are necessary, where they serve an actual useful purpose. Generally speaking, when there's opportunities for a voluntary transfer, for voluntary trade, to make a middleman do stuff. For example, you could have a system of farmers markets, right, where the farmer, picks his crops and then goes to the market and sells the crops himself. But it's also true that at least in certain situations, it might make more sense for a guy to go from farm to farm in the morning and pick up some crops, and then him to go sell these crops to other people at a market or at a grocery store, right? That's a middleman, but he's performing a useful service. He's allowing the farmer more time to do the work that he's specialized at, that is to say, farming, and he's taking all of these goods that are in disparate areas and bringing them to one central location so that consumers who want multiple types of food can buy them all at one place. That's a basic middleman function that is extremely useful in the actual economy. Kropotkin's characterization of non-manual labor as idle is also a mistake. This is something that Lenin made this mistake. He's like, all managers need to do is arithmetic to figure out, what to do next for the factory. And it's not true that entrepreneurship is just simple application of, addition, subtraction, multiplication, and division. There's a lot more to it than that. And, failing to notice that is a major flaw in a lot of these hyper-aggregated, centrally controlled or centrally planned systems of economic thought. I've got a bunch of citations here. Like, I have something from Henry Higgs on the influence of the physiocrats. I have from Rothbard. There's a chapter in his book, An Austrian Perspective on the History of Economic Thought, Volume 1. I'll link to that. It's a long book, but there is something in there about the physiocrats, and later on he does talk about their value theory mistakes. And then there's also a great chapter by Walter Block in the first Defending the Undefendable book called The Middleman. And this is, in fact, a solid debunk of the notion that no middleman can possibly be productive, as Kropotkin is arguing. Now, I said this just a minute ago, but communists of all sorts, and Keynesians and a lot of economics people ignore the value of entrepreneurship as a skill. This is something that Austrian theory does really, really well. Is incorporating the entrepreneur into economic production, examining the conditions of the economy, and determining which business ventures are likely to be profitable is not a trivial task. It's not something that just anybody can do. The complex interplay between entrepreneurs, holders of capital, consumers, workers, producers, all of these things depend on the movement of capital out of the hands of those with bad entrepreneurial judgment and into the hands of those with good judgment. There's an article by Per Byland called Why Social Entrepreneurship is No Substitute for Market Entrepreneurship. And there's also a thing by Ralph Ryko about Trotsky, where he talks about the Lenin quote about managers just needing basic mathematics and kind of debunks that a little bit. By the way, it's important to remember that this movement of capital that I'm talking about, from bad entrepreneurs to good entrepreneurs, or at least that's the net appearance. If you were kind of looking at it from the sky, you might see it that way. This is not the product of seizure or appropriation or violent overthrow. Bad entrepreneurs dedicate capital, and they get capital from capitalists who have bad, perception of who the good entrepreneur is, right? There's mistakes that happen, right? And these bad entrepreneurs dedicate capital into the production of unwanted or less wanted goods, Good entrepreneurs put capital to use in making additional goods that are also desirable. They take goods that have, a market value, and they reconstruct them into goods that have a higher market value. Very basic profit idea, right? And then they can take part of that profit, and invest it into more capital. That means that the capitalists who funded the good entrepreneurs get a return, a positive return, which they like because it increases the amount of capital they hold. And as long as they keep betting on good entrepreneurs, they can keep getting more and more capital. And that capital is not just like sitting, in the palm of their hand. It's in the form of factories in which they have an ownership interest. It's in the form of, mines or whatever that they have ownership interests in. And these things are being worked on by general people in such a way that things that are produced go to the masses. The masses earn wages without having to accept any of the entrepreneurial risk that the capitalist accepts. Stuff like that. When the process of entrepreneurship is handed over to state agents, their complete lack of accountability strikes a major blow against their ability not just to handle, but to evaluate the handling of capital. Since some of these processes can be very roundabout and long-term. It might be that you're investing in the production of a factory where you earn nothing for 5 years, and then after 5 years, production finally begins, and then the returns come, and the returns make up for the 5 years of idleness, as Kropotkin would see it, with actual profits that actually make up for that missed time. Plus, state agents, when dealing with pseudo-entrepreneurial functions, lack information. This is something that Mises talks about. It's something that Hayek talks about, and eventually they'll lack meaningful prices too, because when you centralize the planning of production, prices no longer really mean that much, because those goods, those capital goods, are no longer being traded on a free market, or even a hindered market, right? And so prices kind of stagnate. It's like, well, this machine that creates buggy whips was really valuable, and so we're going to assume it stays similarly valuable, when in fact the car has been invented and buggy whips are no longer particularly useful for the vast majority of people. These prices, again, are information. This is a fundamental part of economic understanding, that prices contain information, and they serve as clues for how to use capital goods. Similarly, if you took the process of entrepreneurship and you handed it over just to unskilled entrepreneurs, right? What you're doing is you're turning back the clock on the process that allows productivity to be increased over time. The market process is a process where bad entrepreneurs get kicked out of the business because they lose, what they've been handed capital-wise, and nobody wants to hand them capital anymore. There's no aggression in that process, right? And then good entrepreneurs get more capital for the people that hold capital and depend on the good entrepreneurs, which creates additional goods for people, including the masses, to use. This is kind of a time lapse process, right? Like where, starting from some arbitrary starting point, Bob doesn't know whether he's a good entrepreneur or not. What happens is that over time, he will, either find out, yeah, I'm making profits, I'm doing good, I am a good entrepreneur, or he'll find out I'm making losses, and he'll say, well, maybe I should get into a different business. When you take goods away from good entrepreneurs and give them to randos, right? You're basically turning back the clock on this process, which is kind of the driving force for the increase of capital goods and therefore welfare of humanity in general. The result of this is nearly always a decline in capital, or allocation of capital to production of less desirable goods. So, the next thing Kropotkin talks about is he kind of talks about this wastefulness that he sees in capitalism. He talks about like people dumping oysters into the sea because they overproduce them and they don't want to give them to the masses, kind of thing. He's basically talking about engineered scarcity of luxury goods for the purpose of keeping them as luxury goods. Now, there's two main problems with this. Number one, Kropotkin is describing behavior that can really only be maintained long-term by either state intervention, that is to say requirements that all oysters below a certain weight must be thrown into the sea, or by cartelization. If this is state intervention, then this is already not a function of a free market, a laissez-faire market, and therefore, this is a valid criticism of state intervention, not the laissez-faire market. If this is cartelization, then the usual economic arguments about the fleeting nature of cartels applies. For instance, there's a chapter in Rothbard in Rothbard's Man, Economy, and State that covers cartels. I believe it's chapter 10. Cartels are fleeting in nature unless they're supported by state intervention. There's always an incentive for some guy in the cartel to break out and say, here, have some oysters, kind of thing, because that adds profit to him, while, either the cartel agreement is just like a gentleman's agreement, or it's enforced by the state, which in that case, it's not part of the market. It's also worth noting that even in the case of cartels trying to maintain things as like exclusive luxury goods, many such luxury goods kind of eventually work their way into the general market anyway, right? This is one of those very destroying private property is a permanent solution to a temporary problem, basically. There's this gradual advancement of the capital structure under laissez-faire in normal conditions. And basically what you're doing, you're saying, well, it's not going fast enough. And so in order to make it go faster, we're going to do these things that basically cripple the process that makes it move forward in the first place. We're going to destroy those incentives that don't always work to increase wealth, but tend more often than not to do so over time. There's an article by Ryan McMakin called "Why Luxury Goods Make Everyone Better Off" that I think is worth looking at for this particular point. Number 2, Kropotkin is ignoring that the oysters, or whatever good he's talking about, are actually the property of those who are destroying them. Even worse, these oysters are not the means of production. So this is where part of the mask is kind of falling off. Most communists say, oh, we only want to, communize the ownership of the means of production. But here Kropotkin is like, no, personal property too. Yeah, we're gonna take your toothbrush, kind of thing. It's a very, very, it makes all the bad things about communism even worse, because now you can't eat an apple without the permission of every person in humanity. It's worth noting that Kropotkin has not given any meaningful, logical or philosophical argument against private ownership of the means of production, let alone personal property. And such an argument would not even, apply to oysters if it was only a means of production argument. If you have if I have a toothbrush, I can destroy the toothbrush. That's what personal property means. But Kropotkin is actually going further than, say, like Marx, Lenin, and Stalin went, which is terrifying, honestly. I had that quote at the very start of the previous video, right? Forbidding the private ownership of consumption goods would literally lead either to totalitarianism or the extinction of mankind, and probably both. It's dumb, basically. Kropotkin then discusses how, quote, millions of men would, quote, gladly, quote, reclaim wastelands or, quote, transform uncultivated land into fertile fields, etc. Instead, holders of capital prefer to hire, quote, Egyptian fellows, Italian exiles, and Chinese coolies as, quote, wage slaves. This is a major self-contradiction, and I'm surprised that this isn't like, oh, this is dumb. Like, this whole thing is just built on a literally self-contradictory, assumption that just doesn't make sense. If those millions would gladly do the labor as he suggests, then they should be happy to accept low wages to do so, right? The fact that they're unwilling to do so for the wages being offered means that by definition, they have better things to do with their time and their value in general. This is a complete logical self-contradiction that Kropotkin is making here. And it's basically saying, well, they would gladly do this if it weren't for these people that are doing it for lower wages. And it's like, yeah, the disutility of labor is a real freaking thing. And Kropotkin is like ignoring it, basically saying, well, if we give them everything they need, then in return, right, they'll do these things. But the fact is that if you give someone a bare subsistence, they're not going to want to do the dirty jobs. They're going to want to do the nice and easy jobs. They're going to want to be the guy that the guy, the wine taster, right? Not the trash compactor man. This is one of those things where he inadvertently cripples his own argument by making something fundamentally by making a statement that's fundamentally self-contradictory. No, they wouldn't gladly reclaim these wastelands. They would do so for pay that is above the pay that people who want these wastelands are willing to pay to reclaim them. Some resources are not worth trying to grab, right? It would cost a lot more for us to go and get moon rocks than it would cost for us to get rocks anywhere else. Therefore, even though those moon rocks are a resource, we don't utilize them. They're out of reach. And there are some wastelands that require so much work to reclaim that either nobody wants to do it because nobody wants to pay for it. The resources aren't there to do it right now. In a later date, productivity might increase to a point where where the reclaiming of these lands might be worth doing. But this is basically Kropotkin making kind of a stupid value judgment and then pushing on it until it makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. He goes on to lament, quote, spending human toil on objects absolutely useless or destined only to satisfy the dull vanity of the rich, end quote. He suggests that wealth spent on judges, prisons, and policemen are wasted because crime is the pure result of impoverishment. False. He argues against keeping up the stables, kennels, and retinue of the rich. And he says that the goods and labor used for such could instead go toward more factories and the production of basic goods for the masses. Kropotkin is smuggling in his own value judgments here. First, it's incorrect to state that with material wealth, crime vanishes. Instead, I would argue that cultural systems that encourage wealth production, just happen to similarly discourage criminality. Private property is a great example of that. If you can defend your private property, then that is a big disincentive for someone to try to steal it. And also, the institution of private property allows people to own capital and build up capital via entrepreneurship and investment and savings. These two things go hand in hand, and it's a mistake to assume that it's just a function of wealth, right? A single cause can have two results, but it doesn't follow that this result necessitates this other result, because you could have something that only does one and not the other, for instance. Cultural systems like respect for private property, etc., do both of these things, but alternative systems that don't respect private property don't do both of these things. We've seen what happens when relatively wealthy city dwellers in America are told that shoplifting will not be prosecuted. They steal. That disrespect for private property unleashes all of mankind's worst tendencies, and it does far more damage than politicians are often willing to admit. As far as toil spent on stables and kennels for the rich, if these things really aren't productive, if these things are really useless, then Kropotkin should be heralding them as great ways for wealth to move from the rich to the poor. This is a method by which the relative poor can voluntarily appropriate some of the rich's resources. It seems very odd to complain about the wastefulness of the rich, since if the rich waste things, that is to say, if the rich either destroy their own property or pay people to upkeep their existing property, what that does is it effectively narrows the wealth gap. And, I think it's a mistake to care especially about such things as wealth gaps, because they aren't necessarily the product of oppression. We should look at the causes for specific wealth gaps, and we should say, well, is this person stealing? Is this person using the government to give him extra wealth at the expense of others? Is this person appropriating tax money? Is this person committing fraud? Those are all things that we can condemn, but simply working hard and having a having a hutch of rabbits, right, is not theft. This is like, yeah, you and I both caught a rabbit. And then the next day, you and I both caught a rabbit. You ate one of your rabbits. I took my 2 rabbits and I put them in a hutch, and now I have more rabbits. There's no aggression there. There's just differences in time preference and like the value of saving, basically. Again, if we get rid of the value of saving, then people won't do it. And again, if I have to hire someone to deal with my giant hutch of rabbits, then, what I'm doing is I'm basically giving them wealth to help me maintain the value of some part of my own wealth that gives me, happiness in some way. It makes, if I do this well, then maybe I can maintain the value of my wealth. But if I do it poorly, then what happens is my wealth goes to people who are poorer than me until I'm poor myself. It's a self-correcting problem, basically. Remember, at this point, Kropotkin has not yet offered any logical or philosophical argument against private property. He's only offered us envious rhetorical gibberish that applies even in a world where all of our needs are actually met, right? Like, if all of us get all the food that we want, and all of us have nice houses, and all of us have this, and all of us have that, then these points that Kropotkin is still making will still apply to the person who saves a little bit more and happens to have a little thing over, everybody else. This is, of course, massively self-destructive reasoning. It leads to, basically the impoverishment of mankind by way of a constant envious fight for the lowest common denominator. It's crazy. And nobody should really follow along with this and be like, oh yeah, anybody that has more than me, I can take his stuff. Well, that's not a universalizable rule, because you also have more than somebody, and the person that you have a little bit more than, he has more than somebody else. Unless and until there's absolute wealth equality, there's always some envious reason for someone to take something from others. And the first thing that would happen if everyone had equal wealth is that wealth would become unequal again. There would be someone who says, "Oh yeah, pay me $1, and I'll play. I'll show you me playing a game of ping pong against somebody else who's really good at ping pong, right?" And you would immediately have, the standard Rothbardian example, I think, is like a Wilt Chamberlain, right? He's like, yeah, pay me $1 and I'll play a game of basketball, and you can watch me play a game of basketball and you'll be entertained. And the people are like, cool, we all have equal wealth. 1 million of us give Wilt Chamberlain $1. Now Wilt Chamberlain has $1 million, and all of us are a dollar, poorer. Well, now we have to re-equalize, wealth again, because, you guys made a choice that created wealth inequality. Choices do that. The only way to avoid choices that destroy wealth equality is to eliminate choice, that is to say, totalitarian government. The next thing Kropotkin talks about is that a more enlightened allocation of productivity would lead to such a surplus that all consumers would have more than they want. This, of course, ignores the very real possibility that new desirable goods would be invented. His physiocratic fallacy strikes again. And this is kind of funny, but the first draft of these notes, I called these things Georgist, and oh man, apparently I've been confusing Georgism with physiocracy for a long time, because they both advocated for a single-use wealth tax, and that is just freaking hilarious, isn't it?
That's not funny. That's not funny at all.
Anyway, this is after Kropotkin laments this enlightened allocation of productivity, he now calls for expropriation, and this is where things get really dirty. Calling for expropriation, first off, is not a good position for a so-called anarcho-communist, right? True, it's not the current state, but if you just steal things from people, then that's basically a de facto state. Pretending that because it's being done for the good of the people is just rhetorical blather. It doesn't mean anything. Kropotkin starts talking about revolution. He notes that, like, for instance, old rulers of France abdicated power in 1848, other such instances like that. He talks about how the army can lose its commanders and everyone decides to kind of be a commune instead. He continues with a bunch of largely utopian gibberish about previously indifferent men suddenly becoming very interested in public affairs, stuff like that. The people take the now empty seats of government, and the end result of this theatrical chaos is a breakdown in production. Meanwhile, quote, meanwhile the people suffer. The factories are idle, the workshops closed, industry is at a standstill, end quote. The question for Kropotkin is, how do we find the way out of these difficulties? His answer is that everyone has to magically declare that he has the, quote, right to live, by which he doesn't just mean the right to live, right? What he means is the right to live at the expense of others just because. Basically, he means that society is bound to share amongst all. And if that sort of binding isn't a state, I don't know what is. Basically, what he's done is he's gone from declaring a right to live to the total abolition of private property, both capital and personal, without making an argument. He just says, oh, well, this is what we need to do. This is the scientific thing to do. He merely states that the people need these goods, therefore they ought to take them. This train of thought is painfully vulnerable to weaponization of envy, as I just mentioned. Even in a world where every person magically received a livable level of support, the existence of those with even a bit more, through voluntary savings, would be a reason for them to say that they need the extras that those people have to live, right? These are all these terms that get twisted around in order to basically mean whatever the communists want. Oh, I need, a 1,700 square foot house with 2 bathrooms and 3 bedrooms kind of thing. Well, no, people can and do live in mud huts. And so therefore you can't need anything more than a mud hut or even a sleeping bag under a bridge, right? And yet what ends up happening is that whenever there's a surplus, they say, oh, I need that surplus, because it's not about needing it to live. It's about envying the fact that someone else has more. And as we've just mentioned, that's a hole with no bottom. We see here the danger of this floppy use of terms like need. They justify constant and repeated, forcible leveling of any differences in wealth until the best producers, or anyone who produces at all, is so beaten down that they refuse to produce anymore. Then we end up with a collapse. People say, oh, I'm not going to make anything. Everything that I make just gets taken away from me. I gain nothing by doing this. The labor has a non-zero disutility. Why am I bothering to do this? And you end up having to either, basically collapse society and have everybody go off on their own and start doing their own thing. You get a breakdown of the of division of labor, which is terrible. Or you end up with a totalitarian government that forces people to work, which is just slavery. Far be it for me to say that Kropotkin's anarcho-communism is just slavery with extra steps, but that is kind of what it looks to be. Kropotkin here is elevating the needs of people over their duties by, quote, taking immediate and effective possession of all that is necessary to ensure the well-being of all, end quote, and he calls this, quote, scientific. Now that well-being word is a real tricky one because well-being means a lack, to Kropotkin, well-being means a lack of envy of others, windfalls. This is, of course, rhetorical gibberish. It's anti-economic nonsense. We know how quickly the capital structure can collapse when those in charge of it have no stake in the game. There's an article by Henry Hazlitt called "Private Ownership: A Must" that I'll put a link to in the description and stuff. We know that labor has disutility. Mises in Human Action talks about it. I think that's in chapter 7. I'll link to that as well. When one has no hope of gaining anything from additional labor, it's very difficult to convince him to continue to work. To do so usually requires credible and acted upon threats of violence, i.e. a state. This kind of widespread expropriation would only serve to destroy productivity and give the poor masses a few weeks of relative plenty before everybody basically starved to death. Further, we know that the expropriation of private property requires massive, overwhelming force, basically the state. And this bodes very poorly for Kropotkin's assurance that he's an anarchist communist and not, those statist communists. Even further, even worse, Kropotkin is not merely talking about expropriating the means of production, which would be bad enough. He's talking about expropriating personal and like consumable property and distributing that as well, which is even worse because man can and has gotten by with very little capital, but man cannot get by without food and water and shelter. And destroying the institution of personal property eventually destroys the ability for man to have those things. And this is the best part, or maybe not the best part, but this is the funniest part. Because in the next chapter, Kropotkin is going to explain how this all makes sense. Because the next chapter is called Anarchist Communism, but I'm not holding my breath that this is going to be any better reasoned than what we've seen so far. So, that is my coverage of Chapter 2, Well-Being for All. It is a rhetorical mess. It is filled with anti-economic nonsense. It is vulnerable to argument ad absurdum in the sense that, in several senses, in the sense that it basically is a society of envy, of permanent envy and complete destruction of any incentive to produce anything. It combines ideas that don't actually fit together, like saying if there's just no poverty, then there won't be any crime. Well, it's the institution of private property that helps to prevent people from committing crime just for fun, which they will do. And it's private property that enables people to save and build up the capital structure. Kropotkin's solution is to get rid of private property and hope that crime will go away for those couple of weeks that everybody has all the stuff that they've expropriated from everybody else. It's not good reasoning. It's not sensible, and it doesn't make any sense from any reasonable economic perspective. All it is an excuse for constantly beating down anyone who does anything more than the bare minimum, and therefore it results in it must inevitably result in a form of organized force that forces people to produce against their own will and against their own interests. So, we'll stop here for today. This has been Chapter 2 of Kropotkin's The Conquest of Bread. Incredibly poor reasoning, incredibly poor, just doesn't make sense, makes absurd, rhetorical arguments without making any rational case for these things. And now he's going to, and next he's going to tell us why this is actually anarchist, which I'm having trouble believing, to be honest with you. Anyway, that's what I've got for today. Hope you enjoyed. I'll have links in the description, or they might not fit in the description on some platforms. And so if you want, you can go to my blog where I'll have a PDF with my notes for this chapter. And I'll also have links and stuff there as well. So yeah, thanks for watching. Thanks for listening. I hope you found this informative. If you like what I'm doing with the channel, you know what to do. And I will catch you next time. We'll be doing Chapter 3 next week. I might have another video in the meantime. We'll see. But until next time, I will see you later and have a good week.